So what is Blazor? Blazor is a SPA framework, a single page application framework. It works in very similar ways to React or Angular. The name comes from a combination of browser and Razor. And Razor is the way Microsoft way to mix C# code and markup. So in this case, HTML and C# code. And the browser comes from, well, it ran in your browser. There are two ways of hosting Blazor, server side and client side. And we're going to start with server side. Server side works like this. What is actually happening is that we are running our Razor components. That's the Razor part of things. And that is going to generate HTML. Blazor is going to take over and create a render tree, a virtual representation of the DOM, what we want the DOM to look like. Then we have an H1 and a button, for example. Then on the browser side of things, we have the DOM and we have a little piece of JavaScript. The JavaScript connects to the server using a SignalR connection. So the best possible way to communicate in more or less real time with the server. The Blazor part on the server side is going to push the HTML over to the JavaScript, and then the JavaScript is going to update the DOM. So if I click the button, that event is going to go over to the JavaScript, over to SignalR connection, and over to Blazor. Blazor will handle the event, and the code that lives in the Razor component is going to run. In this case, making a very subtle change. It changed Blazor with Blazor rules from a Z to an S instead in the rules part. So it's just going to change that in the render tree and push that change, and that change only over SignalR. To be honest, the H1 is not going to be represented in what is sent over, but just for visualization, I kept that. So it's just going to push this change over and update the DOM. So if you worked with Angular or React, you would probably recognize this kind of behavior. Instead of a render tree, we have a virtual DOM or a shadow DOM, stuff like that. All right, let's take a look at a demo. So I'm going to build a to-do app, and I've named this to-do app Mana Mana because to-do. I do like puns, but I am worthless at singing, so I'm sorry about that. So here we have Visual Studio, and I have created a couple of projects. I have the Mana Mana project, which is the server-side Blazor project. I have a Razor project, which is the shared component that we're going to use for both server-side and WebAssembly. And we have a shared project where we have our data models. Let's take a look at the data models first. In here we have a to-do item, and it has an ID. It has whether or not it's done or not. It has a title and a description. And on the title, I've added a couple of attributes. So I'm saying that I require this to be, and I require a title. And I require that title to be a minimum of 5 characters. Now that doesn't make sense perhaps, but it's just to show you how we can validate that in the end. I do have an API living in the cloud, but since this is not an API talk, I'm not going to talk a lot about that. We will see how it interacts with the API as well. So let's take a look at, let's just run the project. So here is the standard template, the template that when you go file new Blazor server project, this is what you get. So we have a counter. If I click the counter, it's going to count up. Believe me, you will get stuck at this. Ooh, it's clicking. It's doing stuff. This is so much fun. Maybe I'm easily entertained. Then we have a weather forecast. So this gets data from the server. And we have a to-do list, which we're going to build together. If you take a look at what is happening on the network, and if I reload the page, you will notice that we are downloading JavaScript, a little bit of CSS. Then we're going to negotiate, and we're going to create a WebSocket. So we have a WebSocket that is the connection to the server. If we go into that and we check messages, you will see that it's sending binary messages back and forth. So if I'm clicking the click me button, nothing gets reloaded. The page is intact. It's just going to send a WebSocket request and I get a WebSocket response, as you can see. Great. So if we take a look at what the counter looks like, it looks like this. So what we have here is we have a why isn't that? My pen stopped working. What's up with that? For some reason, my pen stopped working. I can use this maybe. So we have a counter, a page directive that says that this URL, if I go to /counter, I want the counter component to get loaded. I have a h1 header. I have a current count and a variable. The at sign is transferring me into C# world from HTML. And as you can see, I'm using HTML, and then I'm just going into C# land. I have a button, and on click, I'm going to run the increment count. So the at sign here is telling Blazor that the onClick is a Blazor method. It's not the JavaScript onClick method. So that's the difference. If it just wrote onClick, you would get the JavaScript method. At onClick, that's the Blazor onClick. I have a private variable called current count, and I have the increment method, the increment count method that is going to increment the count. So if I press the increment count, the increment count method is going to run. It's going to update the current count, and it's going to update the current count variable. So I don't have to tell the UI that I want it to get updated. It knows that the UI is using this variable. The variable changed, so I need to update that as well. Sweet. We're going to take a look at the fetch data a little bit later on. So let's jump into our to-do app instead. So here I have the server-side project, and I have a shared Razor project. So I can put all my components into shared library. So in this case, I have a to-do list component. So the first thing we need something to add our to-do items to. So let's create that. We need to have a list of the to-do item. So I'm referring to the manamana.shared project in the Razor project as well. So I'm going to say I need a list of to-do items. I want it to be called list, and I want it to be an empty list. Then we need to get the items somehow. And then I'm just going to inject the to-do item service or to-do service. And I'm going to call it service. The to-do service is just HTTP request to the API I have in Azure. So I have a delete item, I have an update item, add item, and most importantly, get items, so I can get all the items. So now I need to fill the list somehow. So I'm going to override the onInitialized async. I'm going to say items await service.getItems. And then I'm going to call the base method as well. There we go. So now I have a list of items, or at least I have a list that I can put items in. I have filled it with items, and now I need to show the items as well. So we're going to create a for each. I'm going to say at, just going to say that I'm transferring from HTML into C# code. For each item in items, the items collection or a list. I'm going to create an li. I'm going to create a checkbox. I'm going to bind it to the is done. So when I check that checkbox, it's automatically going to update the is done on that specific object. I'm going to say on click. I'm going to run the update item method. We're going to write that in just a second. So when I click it, I want to make sure that not only the collection is going to change, I'm going to push that change to the server as well. I'm also going to create a nav link. So a link that I could click and get to that page. And we're going to create a to-do page that is going to show our to-do item. And we're just going to add the item ID. And I want the URL to be the title of the item. But then we're going to create a button as well. But this button is going to be the delete button. So it's a danger button. So I want to add a class called danger as well. This is using Bootstrap. The template is using Bootstrap, and so am I in this sample. And on click, I want to run the delete item method. I want the button to say delete. And then we're just going to finish up the li and the for each. So let's take a look at the update item. So I created the update method. We're simply going to call the service, the to-do service, and I'm going to send in the item. So it's going to get updated. Because the item is updated at this point in time. We need to add an await there as well. And the delete item, when we're deleting items, we want to make sure that, are you really sure that you want to delete the item? And here we can use JavaScript interrupts if you want to. Now I promised a world without JavaScript. It could be a world without JavaScript, but the nice thing is that you can actually use JavaScript if you want to. So I'm going to create a variable. And I'm going to wait the JS runtime. So JavaScript runtime. I'm going to say invoke async. I'm going to expect a bool back, and I'm going to run the JavaScript confirm command. And I'm asking, do you really want to delete this? And if I do want to delete it, I will say that I'm going to run the service delete item. And I'm also going to make sure that I'm going to delete the item from the collection. So I don't need to reload all the items. I just need to delete it from the collection of the list. And I'm also going to say state has changed because this method is good. Since it's an async method, I need to make sure that I'm going to tell the UI that it has updated. Also need to inject the JS runtime. So I'm going to say inject JS runtime. I'm going to call it JS runtime. Let's add a title as well. I'm going to add an H2. So my items, parenthesis, and then I'm going to switch over to C#. I'm going to say items.where is for all the items that is not done at this point. Count them and show that. All right, so if I run the project now, I can go to my to-do list and everything explodes. You'll see that we'll get a little an unhandled exception has occurred. See browser tools. Let's do that. Let's pop into the browser tools, into the console. And what it's saying here, it cannot provide a value for the property service because we have not registered the to-do service. Even though we're getting the error in the console, the error is a C# error. This is if we worked with C# before, we know, with dependency injection, we know what this error means. So let's pop back to our Manamana project, and we're going to add in the startup, going to add our to-do service. Add scoped to-do service. There we go. And if I rerun the project, we will get some items. And if I click the items, you will see that the my items counter is going to get counted up. And if I reload the page, it's still going to be persisted. And if I click delete, do you really want to delete that? No, I don't. And it's going to stay there. If I click delete and I click OK, it's going to disappear. And hopefully, if I reload it, it's not going to pop up. No. So we built a very, very simple to-do app just by using C# and a little bit of JavaScript, to be fair. But this looks like crap, right? So let's see if we can make it a little bit more nice to look at. So in the Manamana project, I have a CSS file. So in the www root folder, all the files in the www root folder is going to be they will be exposed, if you will. I will be able to get to those files. So I have a CSS folder and I have to-do styles. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go into our Sass file here. And we need to add a couple of things. So I'm going to import our to-do list. I'm going to import our form list. And let's just add the animations as well. So I'm just going to add a couple of, let's see if, yeah, I've added a couple of imports in the Sass file. So I have a to-do Sass file here with a couple of styles. I have a form, so it's going to make the forms look more like Bootstrap. I also have a, just for fun, an animation. So you will see that the list, when we go and look at the list, it's going to flow in a little bit. So in the manamana.razor, I have the, so if you haven't worked with Sass, the Sass is going to be compiled to CSS. So when I'm saving the Sass file, it's going to produce the to-do styles CSS. So if we pop back to our Manamana project and go into our host file, so the host file is the file that is going to get called first. Here we have a bunch of HTML. We have a little bit of error handling, the error you saw. And we also have a rendering of a component called app. The app component then handles all the routing. So it's going to make sure that I'm going to get routed to the right component. So in our host file, I'm going to add style. So I'm going to say, I'm just going to add a normal style. I'm going to say href content. So content is telling Blazor that in this case, the CSS that I want to load is living in another library. And in this case, it's living in the manamana.razor library. And in the CSS folder, and the to-do style is called to-do styles min CSS. And it's a style sheet. There we go. So if we run it again, I don't know, I'm not a designer, but I think it looks a little bit better than before, at least. All right. So next up, we want to be able to show you an item. We want to create an item. So we're gonna, let me see, I need to check my notes here. There we go. So we need to add an edit form. And I have prepared one. So in the Razor file, we have a to-do item edit. So here I have a to-do item. Not sure what this one is supposed to do. Right, we need to, yeah, right. So what we need to add is we need to add a parameter, which is a to-do ID. So when I'm browsing to this page, I'm gonna get an ID. So the parameter makes it available outside the component. I'm going to say that I want the to-do item. I also have the current item that I'm editing there as well. I have the I need to load the item. So on the parameter set, so when I'm setting this variable, I want to check if it's 0. If it's 0, I'm going to assume that I want to create a new item. So I'm going to say item.await. I'm going to call the service again. Going to call the getItem method, and I'm going to send in the to-do ID. Now, if it is 0, I'm just going to assume that I'm going to create a new one. So I'm going to say item.newToDoItem. There we go. So on the parameter set, if the to-do item is not 0, I'm going to get the item. If it is 0, I'm just going to create a new one. Right. So let's add the form. So we're going to create an edit form. So edit form is a way to get a lot of functionality for free. I'm going to say edit form. I'm going to send in the model, in this case, the item, and on valid submit. So if I submit this form and it is valid, I want it to run the save item method. I'm going to add a data annotation validator. So the data annotation validator is going to check the item and make sure that all the annotations, data annotations, is valid. So you might remember that we had the title was required and the length was a minimum of 5. So it's going to make sure that those annotations are valid. We're going to create a class or div. I'm going to create a label. I'm going to say title. I'm going to create an input text. So an input text is the Blazor version of the input, the normal HTML input type text. I'm going to bind the value to the item's title. So when I change the input text, the item's title is going to change as well. I'm also going to add a validation message for the title. So if the title is less than 5 characters, the error message is going to show up in that validation message. I'm going to close off the div. I'm also going to add one for the description. In this case, I'm using an input text area. I'm going to bind the value to description. I'm going to add a validation message just as before. And I'm also going to add a button. The button is going to be a success button because we want to have success. And it's going to be type submit. So the edit form works in very similar ways to the just normal form tag. I don't have to redirect it, push it to a specific location. It's just going to handle it. The code is going to, the save item code is going to run on a successful submit. In the same method, save item, I have a item ID. I'm checking if it is 0, I want to save it. If it's not 0, I want to update it. Now, what we can do is we can make this component to be a little bit more reusable. So I'm going to add an event callback. I'm just going to add a parameter. I'm going to have an event callback, and I'm going to send back the to-do item. And I'm going to say item added. I'm going to call it item added. And when I'm saving the item, I'm going to call that event. Item added, invoke async new item, like that. So if you go back to the to-do list, we can add the edit component here. I'm going to say the to-do item edit. So the cool thing with components is that you can use components as pages, as we have seen, and you can use it as components within components. So I'm going to say to-do item. I'm going to listen to the item added event, and I'm going to run the item added method. I'm going to pop down here. I'm going to add that method as well. So this is a async task item added. It's taking in a to-do item because that was how we defined it. And it's just going to say items add. We're going to add it to the list. If we have one more thing we need to do. So in the server project, we have it to do Razor. So here we're going to add a parameter. I'm going to add a parameter, and it's going to take an int, which is the to-do ID. So if I go to /to-do and then the item, it's going to come to this page. Actually, we don't know that yet. Now we know that. So I'm going to say page. So this component is going to be accessible as a page with a URL to do and the name of the parameter. And then I'm going to specify that I want to make sure that it's an int. So I'm saying that if it's /to-do/ a number, an int, otherwise it won't hit the route. And we're going to add the to-do item edit here as well. And we're going to send in the to-do item like that. So if you take a look here, that we are using the same component, the same to-do item edit. In this case, we're sending in an ID, so it's going to load that ID. In the to-do list, we're using the same component, but we're not sending in an ID because we want it to be 0. We're only going to create new items, and we're listening to the item added. Let's see if it works. I'm going to go to our to-do list. You see we have a form here. I'm going to type hello. That shouldn't have worked. Right, it is 5. I'm counting oddly. And we're not going to create one that says hell. Hi. Let's do that instead. So you will immediately get an error message saying that the field title must be a string or array type with a minimum length of 5. This error message, you can customize that as well. So I'm not going to be able to save this at this point. So if I instead say hello and I press save item, it's just going to pop up down here. Don't have to tell it that it needs to pop up because it knows that the UI is using the list and it's going to show that. Sweet. Let's pop back to the presentation. There we go. All right, so we have client side or WebAssembly as well. So we need to take a step back. How does JavaScript work normally? Well, you will download the JavaScript. It's going to get downloaded either if it's in a JS file or if it is inline. It's going to get parsed and it's going to get compiled. And then it's going to get into the JIT interpreter. But WebAssembly is machine language. So it can bypass almost all of that and directly, the JIT interpreter is going to directly be able to understand what is happening. So what Microsoft did was that they took, or Steve took an open source project. What Microsoft did was that they took the mono runtime and compiled that to WebAssembly. So the mono runtime is running inside your web browser. And then it's going to download your DLLs and Microsoft's DLLs and run those inside of the browser. So what is not happening is that we're not compiling C# to WebAssembly. We have compiled C code, which is the mono runtime, to WebAssembly that is executing your DLLs, your standard .NET DLLs. When I first heard about that, I was like, I got a little bit of bad taste in my mouth because we're running the .NET runtime inside of the web browser. That must have an impact in some way. But when you think about it, it's running the .NET runtime inside of the browser. You can say the exact same thing and with amazement instead, because it's just insane what they have achieved there. So here we have the server side again. So we have the server side over there and the browser here. So if you compare that to the WebAssembly version, the only thing that changes is where things are running, basically. We are now running inside of the browser. The browser is running the mono runtime. The mono runtime is executing your Razor component that is generating Blazor, that is generating a render tree, that is going to update the DOM. But we're not using SignalR. We're using direct JavaScript interrupts instead, because WebAssembly don't have access to change the DOM. So it's only going to, you need something in between. Server side is SignalR, in WebAssembly it's JavaScript interrupts. So let's take a look at WebAssembly. Pop back. The WebAssembly project looks pretty much the same. There are some things that are moved around. If you run the project instead of the server one, you will see that we have a counter, just as before. We have fetch data that is going to get a little bit of weather forecast, and we have a to-do list. The WebAssembly project uses the same Razor file, the same component that we just built using the shared library. If I click the hello here, I'm going to pop into the to-do route with the number 27. This would work on the web. I didn't show it on the server side, but this works as well here. If I click the button, it's still going to count up. So we take a look at what is happening on the network. You will notice that a lot more is happening. We are downloading some JavaScript, and then we're going to download the mono.wasm. Wasm is the WebAssembly version of the mono runtime. We're going to get the mono runtime, and then we're going to download the Meetup, shared, WebAssembly, and then a whole bunch of different DLLs from the .NET framework. The difference here is that we're not using the server anymore. Everything is downloaded to the client. We're not doing a request back and forth to the server. So the nice thing here is that you can share the libraries between the different project types. So if you want to, typically what we have done is that we had an MVC site. We have a really big MVC site, and we changed a couple of years ago everything to view components. So we have small isolated components that only did what they were supposed to do. So we changed one component at a time. Server side, we went the server side route. Now, if we want to, we can take all of those components and then just run them client side instead. We have decided to continue using server side because it's simpler for us. We still have a little bit of a hybrid solution, so we want to be able to use that. So next up we have Blossom. Let's switch back to Visual Studio. I'm going to run the server-side project again. Let's run it and check out fetch data. So fetch data is getting a couple of different temperatures and whether or not it's mild or warm. I have modified this just a little bit. I'm returning like 30 or 50 items instead of, I think it's defaulting to 10 or 5. So I'm returning a little bit more data here. So what we noticed when we started, as I mentioned, we were running in production in October, and not all of the component vendors had created. We needed a grid component, and we checked out all the component vendors like Telerik, Syncfusion, DevExpress. There's loads of them, and there were some features that were missing. I think most of them are at least in the Telerik components right now, but we ended up building our own. So on GitHub, we do have an open source project called Blossom.components. So Blossom is a combination of Blazor and our company name Awesome Dev. So Blossom, and I got it in a pun there as well. It will make your components or your site blossom. I'm so sorry. I can't stop if I start. So what you can do with the Blossom components, so this is open source. You can use it however you like. We can create a grid. We can add data. Well, actually, we're not going to go through that. I'm going to show you that instead. But we have paging, we have sorting, you can have checkboxes if you want to. It has grouping, footer, an empty grid templates. It has formatting if you want to. It has a lot of features. So let's take a look at implementing that. I'm going to pop into the fetch data. I'm going to add I've added the NuGet package. So I'm just going to say using Blossom components. I'm going to add the Blossom components. I'm going to say Blossom grid. I'm going to use the forecast data. I'm going to say that I want 10 items per page. I want it to be sortable, and I want it to sort it on name of weather forecast date. So it's going to be sorted on date by default. Then I'm going to add grid columns. I'm going to add a grid column and with the field. And then I'm using the name of again here, date. The nice thing with using the name of is that if the grid would change something or the data would change, you would get a compile error. It's going to be a little bit easier. And then I'm going to say format D. So I want just to show the date in a nice format. I'm going to add priority because the grid is going to figure out how many columns that you can see. And if you can see, if the columns are taking more than screen size, it's going to remove columns and it's going to put it in a drop down instead. I'm going to add a grid column for temperature in Celsius. This one is a little bit odd, the highlight sign. So as I mentioned, I'm working in a bank. So if we have positive values, we want to have blue values, and if you have negative values, we want to have red values. In this case, I'm just for fun using the highlight sign just to show you the functionality. It doesn't make sense to have that on the temperature. And I can also add a class. I'm going to align that right. I'm going to add a one for Fahrenheit as well. I'm going to align that right. And we're going to add a one for summary as well. Like that. So the Blossom grid, you will use these lines compared to, let me close that. If you would render it yourself, you would need all of those lines, but we're using a whole lot less. It's very, very easy to get to work with. What we also need to do, to check my notes here, need to go into the host file. I'm going to add some styles. And just as with the Manamana project, this is a NuGet package. I'm going to say content, the blossom.components library or assembly, CSS, and I'm going to add the styles there. Go. With .NET 5, there's going to be a lot of awesome things that you won't need to add this manually later on. But we're not in .NET 5 land just yet. We're going to add a script. I'm going to add the Blossom component script, just as with the CSS. I'm going to add a friend of mine who have wrote a Blazor size. So my library is using his library to figure out the size of the screen. So I need to include that as well. And we need to have font awesome. I'm going to add font awesome here as well. There we go. It needs to set up some things. So in our startup, we need to add Blossom here as well. Now, while preparing this demo last night, I realized that this is an extension method that says add grid. I'm going to change that to say add Blossom instead, because well, I don't know. I don't know what I thought when I created that name. So if I run the project now and I go to fetch data, If you look at the data, you might remember that I said that I added a little bit of animation. If we reload it, you will see that it's flowing a little bit and it's gonna pop on the end. I don't know if if it looks good or not, but I thought it was a kind of a fun thing to show. So here we have sorting. We have, as you can see, positive values are blue, negative values are red, 0 would be black. And we can page through the data. So it's very easy to get started if you're looking for a component like that. When I was about 7 years old, my parents got me my first computer, and I remember I sat down, I wrote 10, print Jimmy, 20, go to 10. This was actually my first app. And funny enough, it is available on GitHub if you want to download it. Now, when I became a developer, I wanted to see if would it be possible for me to create a ZX Spectrum emulator. It took a very long time. I worked very long and hard on creating that emulator, but finally I got a working C# emulator running my ZX Spectrum code. So when it kind of became my hello world. So when I'm encountering a new technology, I want to see, can I run my emulator on that technology? And of course, Blazor is not going to be an exception. This is my ZX Spectrum emulator running on top of Blazor, on top of, in this case, WebAssembly, running inside of the web browser. I can even code with it. It's a little bit hard because the keyboard is a little bit different than normal computers, if you will. Blazor is awesome. 20, go to 10, run. Blazor is awesome. I can even load a game here. You can check that out. Can jump. So what I'm not going to do, I'm not going to play the game because I am super bad at this game. But please try it out. It's zxspectrum.azurewebsites.net, zxspectrum.azurewebsites.net, and maybe you will do better than I do. Hopefully. Thank you so much for listening.